Thank you for joining me. For this video module, we're going to be going through the second functional area of earned value management, which is planning, scheduling and budgeting. The important thing about earned value management is that scheduling and budgeting are done together. So cost and schedule are fully integrated and you don't do one without the other. So the objectives of this session are to review and understand the planning process for developing baselines and earned value techniques, schedule and estimate development, budgeting hierarchy, control accounts, work packages and planning packages, management reserve and undistributed budgets, performance measurement baselines, which we've already touched on a little bit, and some rules of performance or methods of measurement as they're called. We're going to talk about what an over-the-target baseline is and an integrated baseline review. So the AAC International Body of Knowledge or Skills and Knowledge Framework has actually broken down the planning, scheduling and budgeting knowledge areas into 12 different areas. Firstly, critical path methodology, milestones and deliverables, technical performance requirements, performance measurement baseline, risk assessment and mitigation, control accounts, work packages and planning packages, cost elements, contingency and management reserve, undistributed budget, over the target baselines, IBRs or integrated baseline reviews, and earned value management methods and techniques. So I guess the purpose of planning, scheduling and budgeting is that it enables us to establish a completely integrated and time-phased schedule and budget, broken down to the control account level, against which we can authorise work and measure performance as we're going through the project. It enables us to identify a sequence of authorised work in a manner that gives us visibility. We identify the task interdependencies and we're tracking the critical path as well. So it enables us to clearly identify all the project deliverables, milestones and performance goals. The other thing that we do is we focus on the cost schedule management and ensure that management has visibility for work authorisation, cost control, scope control, schedule control and all of those components. So planning, scheduling and budgeting, it's about identifying, evaluating and managing risks for potential impacts to costs, schedule and work scope. It enables us to provide timely and traceable performance data. So we produce the information, the performance information in a timely manner so that people can do something about it. And it also creates that historical record as well. Even through the planning process itself, it's really good for helping us identify any gaps in scope or any errors or omissions or even double ups between scope between different contractors, for example. It enables us to identify management reserve and undistributed budget and have a method in place for dealing with management reserve and contingency. And of course we have a very objective process for measuring progress on the project and comparing it against the planned work. So the framework for earned value management is once again, it's following this PDCA cycle that is such a fundamental component of the TCM framework. Planning the work, so that's the slow, thoughtful process of thinking everything through, modelling everything virtually, if you like, before doing it in reality. Then coming up with a plan, doing the plan, checking and assessing and measuring how we're going compared to that plan, and then taking actions and changing the plan and taking mitigation steps as needed. So the planning and budgeting process itself establishes a means for defining, scheduling, estimating and aggregating the work scope, cost and schedule, performance and reporting requirements all into one place for the project. So all of these things are being considered as part of the planning process. Oops, I've gone backwards again. So the planning statement of work should basically identify the project goals, encompass the complete scope of work, identify milestones and deliverables, incorporate decisions that can influence the future project. So it's really important to identify key decision points which might have a a fairly significant effect on future forecasts in the future. Provide a sequence of activities that enables the project goals to be established and identifies the resource requirements for the project. And like I mentioned earlier, the plan basically represents the thinking phase of the project, so it's a very collaborative and thoughtful sort of a process, whereas scheduling is different to planning. It's more of the detailed mechanical process. So once those plans are in place, it's about defining that detail, linking that detail, and providing the specifics for how that plan will be delivered. So the schedule includes all key milestones and deliverables. It determines the detailed timing of the operation of the project. It defines specific start and completion dates for the project and the project activities. And it creates logical links between all the activities as well. It reflects the agreed project technical baseline or the project requirements, and it integrates the scope and the cost and the schedule all together in one place. So as part of this process, our overall goal is to come up with this performance measurement baseline. So the idea is we collaborate, we incorporate all of the project requirements, we get team commitment from everybody, and that becomes the benchmark against which we're going to measure the project in the future. There's a number of different aspects to that, to developing that performance measurement baseline, as shown here in the knowledge areas from AAC International. So it's about creating a schedule, performing a risk analysis and developing a risk management plan so that we've allowed certain contingencies and we've got allowances. We've included mitigation steps for risks, understanding and incorporating our estimate, including detailed resource planning, considering what resources are actually available, developing a time-phased budget using like a control account plan, and determining earned value techniques to be implemented. And it's really important to do this up front. So the whole idea is that part of the planning process is actually identifying, okay, when we're in execution, how are we actually going to measure these work packages? What do we all agree is a reasonable method for measuring percent complete? And doing that up front, defining that up front, so that it takes some of that subjectivity away. So this is basically a graphical representation of the development of the performance measurement baseline. And I can't stress enough how important it is to realise that this is a very collaborative and iterative process. So particularly if you've got a complex project, this is not something that somebody does in a dark room or that a contractor throws over the fence to an owner. It's something that should be done in a collaborative manner. Risks and assumptions should be understood, negotiated. It should be a really iterative process. So the idea is we define and organise the work as we did. So we're talking about work breakdown structures, organisational breakdown structures, time phasing the work, estimating the resources and applying the resources from the estimate or adjusting those as they need to be done. Allocating the resources against the schedule and having a look at that time phasing, comparing the needs of the project from a resourcing perspective compared to what's available and doing resource levelling if required. Looking at the pricing as well, so pricing those resources and looking at the time phase cost plan. Returning that to your control account managers, your project managers, and basically iterating the schedule. So that cycle can go round many times depending on the complexity of your project, until you finally reach that stakeholder buy-in or that agreement from your stakeholders, and it's at that point that you really set the performance measurement baseline. So the schedule structure itself, once again, it should be hierarchical, and the idea is that between each of those vertical layers there should be traceability. So in your higher level summary schedules, for example, you're far more likely to have high level management milestones, and as it decomposes down further, you're going to get to your discrete deliverables and activities that make up part of your work packages. So the whole idea is that this is one schedule, and there should be linkages between those lower level details and the higher level activities. That's what is referred to as vertical traceability. Horizontal traceability, on the other hand, is making sure that the sequencing between your activities or the links between your activities, your successor and predecessor logic is in place. So planning and estimating. So the preliminary schedule provides the basis for defining the time phasing of the activities, and it also gives you the opportunity to calculate or estimate escalation as well. So the estimates are based on the scope, the execution plan, and ideally they should be based on the schedule as well. So the estimate might provide some of the bottom-up details for developing the cost baseline and the performance measurement tools, but it's fairly common for the performance measurement baseline to not be in the same level of detail as an estimate. The estimate might be broken out into further detail. It'll typically be rolled up into those control accounts. Some of the estimated resources may need to be modelled at a summary level and detail planned at the appropriate time. So this is very similar to the concept of rolling wave planning, the whole idea being that developing a performance measurement baseline isn't about creating a detail plan right through to the final end of the project. It's about detail planning the stuff that you know, the aspects that you're certain about, and rolling up the things that are still fairly uncertain to the appropriate level of detail to be broken out at the appropriate time when we're ready to set the baseline or to create a work package for those particular work packages. It's really important to consider the basis of estimate to ensure that the assumptions are understood and appropriate, and the appropriate earned value techniques are selected. So in terms of developing a performance measurement baseline, you should have a basis of schedule that is associated with that performance measurement baseline. And if you're incorporating an estimate and you notice that some of the assumptions that were included in the basis of estimate have changed or have evolved for some reason, it's really important that you capture the resource requirements and that you document the basis or the basis for your performance measurement baseline in your PMB, particularly identifying any areas where it's deviated from your estimate. So in terms of estimating and resourcing or cost elements, we've already touched a little bit in the first module on I guess the two broad categories of direct and indirect costs. Most of the direct costs being the ones that are going to be within control of the control account manager and the project manager, whereas the indirect costs are going to be within the control to some extent. Quite often they're time dependent, but they tend to be more controlled at the organisational level. So examples of direct costs being labour, materials, subcontract, equipment, and of course other direct costs, whereas indirect costs tend to be indirect labour such as management support, HR, IT, home office overhead type costs, some of these sorts of things. General plant and facility, office space rental, general and administrative taxes, insurance, financing, some of those sort of elements that are usually handled at an organisational level and assigned to the project using some method. Risk assessment and mitigation. So a key element once in setting the performance measurement baseline is risk assessment and mitigation. So it's about understanding what levels of uncertainty are we dealing with and having a way for dealing with those. And dealing with those might mean adding additional contingency or rolling things up to planning packages, or it could mean adding additional mitigation steps to your schedule to help reduce the risks. So as part of the process, it's important to review and understand the risk management process, typical risk items that might impact projects, to have an awareness of those, risk assessment techniques and risk management fundamentals, and techniques to estimate and incorporate cost and schedule risk into the project baseline. This is usually done through contingency. So a risk is basically the variability or uncertainty in an event that might have a detrimental effect on an activity, or it could have a positive effect as well, in which case it's often framed as an opportunity, but it's all about that uncertainty and the effect that that might have on consequences. So it's the probability that the risk will occur, as well as the potential consequence if that risk does occur. So what is risk management? Risk management is basically the process of dealing with that uncertainty and that risk that we described earlier. So it includes planning for the risk, identifying and assessing risk, analysing risk, and identifying risk handling options. It also means continuously monitoring that risk and documenting the overall risk management program. So it's shown schematically here as a series of phases: identification, assessment, analysis and mitigation. That's actually happening continuously. That cycle or that analysis process happens continuously throughout the project, and it's really a vital aspect of cost management and earned value management as well. So it's the process of identifying, analysing and evaluating actions necessary to best satisfy the project goals, and essentially this is working hand in hand with the overall process of earned value, which is cost and schedule performance management. So risk management tends to be concerned with the identification of future events whose results are uncertain and the development of strategies to deal with those uncertainties. It's the art and science of handling uncertainty of future events to best satisfy project controls and create value. As I mentioned earlier, risk is a fairly broad term. It's often taken with a very sort of a negative connotation, but it really covers risks and opportunities as well. So a lot of that uncertainty can actually result in opportunities for the project for cost reduction and some of those sorts of things as well. So identifying positive outcomes for the project also gives the project the opportunity to improve performance or potentially lower costs. So risk and contingency really work hand in hand together. So this is where risk really joins in with the whole earned value management process very intimately and the whole cost control process. Risk can come from a number of different sources and have the potential to impact the project scope, cost and schedule. Allocating contingency is a way that we anticipate, expect that risk on a project, and we allow for it. We create some buffer to allow for that uncertainty that we're going to have to deal with. So cost risks addresses the uncertainty in the current budget and forecast, whereas schedule risk addresses the uncertainty in the current schedule baseline and the current schedule forecast. Obviously they work hand in hand. If you've got a lot of schedule risk on the project, in particular if there's a risk to the project completion date, obviously that carries a cost risk as well, because there might be all sorts of milestones, all sorts of out of sequence work that has to happen, and of course there'll be an increase in time dependent costs if the project date is extended. So some examples of cost risk are productivity rates, labour costs per hour, the adequacy of support facilities, material pricing is a classic one, or competition on bid requests or market forces if you like, and of course things such as weather that are typically out of the control of the project manager, but they do have the opportunity to mitigate their impacts. So I'm sure you can name a number of examples of risks that you've had to deal with on your own projects. Schedule risks are very similar to cost risks. I guess the cause of these uncertainties is often very similar, but there can be some technical ones related to the schedule, such as the quality of schedule logic, the accuracy of scheduled activity durations, vendor deliveries. There might be particular vendors who are riskier than others, owner-furnished materials and services. Regulatory approvals is a typical one that has a high amount of risk associated with it, and once again weather impacts. So there's a number of different types of risk as well, and they can exist for a variety of reasons, and all of them can potentially impact the scope, cost and schedule in different ways. For example, safety risks, environmental risks, reputational risks, legal risks, all have the potential to impact the cost and schedule performance of the project. So as an earned value professional, you can't say that you're not interested in safety or environmental risks, for example, because mitigating those risks and understanding the potential consequences of them is all part of the scope of the project that you need to allow for and mitigate. So for all of those reasons, it's really important for earned value practitioners to be involved in the risk management process and to be involved in those workshops so that they have an awareness of potential disruptions, but also they have the opportunity to provide input and flag any potential change orders or some of those sorts of things that might need to be made. So how do we allow for this risk when we're creating things like estimates, when we haven't even started the project yet? We've got to try and put some numbers forward or a potential budget forward for a project. The way that we deal with that risk is through contingencies. So I guess to bunch up contingency into a number of different brackets, we can describe it, when we're estimating, we can describe it as estimate contingency, scope contingency and schedule contingency. So estimate contingency, or being the way, being the way that we deal with uncertainties in the defined project scope. And it basically represents the probabilistic determination or confidence level the project team has in the actual content or the scope as it's included in the estimate. Another form of contingency might be scope contingency, And this sort of addresses the technical and programmatic risks outside the scope as it's defined in the actual estimate itself, but may be required within the actual project. So it may be something that can be developed using a Monte Carlo probabilistic determination technique. Then of course there's schedule contingency, and this basically addresses the project team's confidence in the ability to execute the program to the baseline schedule. It's can be a probabilistic determination, and it basically results in an assessment of the time duration, and this time duration can be translated into a cost impact by considering a number of factors, the indirect costs and some of those sorts of things, and whether the uncertainty is actually affecting the critical path of the project, or whether it might be just impacting particular project teams or particular costs. Now, the planning process itself is basically a process of time phasing the estimate or the project scope, the resource planning, and then committing to the plan. So the finalised estimate, both hours and material costs, is loaded into the schedule to create this time-phased baseline to assist in resource planning. Adjustments are made to the schedule as part of the resource levelling process, or as there's different trade-offs or negotiations between different project teams, the schedule could iterate and change quite a lot as it's developed. It's basically continuously fed back to the stakeholders, the idea being to optimise the plan as much as possible before it's committed to. Once stakeholders have agreed and committed to the plan, the baseline's set, and that the whole purpose of the baseline from that point on is just as a yardstick for performance measurement purposes. So here's an example of that performance measurement baseline setting process. So in this particular example or dummy project, we have a fairly simple sort of a project with some WBS elements and some very simple descriptions in the items column. So we have a prepare embankment, construct the bridge, erect a steel structure, install mechanical systems, install electrical systems, and architectural finishing. Each of those elements has a budget associated with it, and the overall budget at completion for the project is 100 units. So once we have those WBS elements and those budgeted values for each one, we can then time phase those budget elements based on the expected start and finish dates of those activities. And from there you can see the blue bars there represent the time phased spreading of the resources for each of those activities. For the next step, we can then apply the budget into those time phased elements. So by spreading the budget of 150 units, for example, for preparing the embankment, in this example we've put a linear spread across June, July and August, representing the time phased resources for that particular WBS element. And then totaling that down the bottom, you can see we effectively come up with like a control account plan or a mini performance measurement baseline for the overall resources on the project. So applying some earned value terminology to some of those quantities down the bottom. The overall budget being our budget at completion or BAC, and the time phased budget at the bottom of the screen you can see represents the planned value. So within period June, for example, we have a planned value of 50 units, July 130, August 160, etc., etc. The performance measurement baseline is typically represented graphically on a curve as well, a cumulative curve, and this is often referred to as an S-curve. So the black line there represents the baseline, and as we go into project execution, we'll typically measure the actual costs, the earned value, and the forecast as well, and having that visual representation allows us to very quickly see how we're trending compared to the original baseline. Okay, the next knowledge area that we're going to talk about is authorised unpriced work. So this is a very tricky area in earned value management because everything that we've spoken about so far has been sort of situation normal, or not I'd say perfect world scenario, but a fairly normal situation on a project where you've planned for work, you authorise the work, and then you go ahead and deliver that work and measure how you're going compared to the original plan. Something that's a little bit disruptive to earned value management is sometimes when there's work that's been authorised, but for whatever reason, due to urgency or the critical nature of it, there hasn't been time to actually allocate budget to it. So there might be an undefined change order that's been directed by the customer, hasn't yet been negotiated into the contract, and work has to begin with direction to submit a formal proposal as soon as possible, for example. So typically this will be done through the change control process, and ideally the way it would work is that there is an initial budget that's given for that for the actual preparation of the proposal itself. And by doing that, by allocating a budget, it helps keeps your overall baseline equal, so you are actually assigning value to that preliminary work. And the idea is that once the proposal comes in and is approved, it should then become part of the performance measurement baseline as well. But until that's happened, budget for authorised unpriced work will typically sit in undistributed budget. In other words, it hasn't yet been allocated to a control account, and it won't be until typically negotiations are completed. Budget is typically allocated for near-term work, as I suggested, so there might be some seed money or a small allocation of money for design or the initiation process of that proposal, depending on negotiations. And then the total budget allocated once that proposal is agreed to. Okay, so continuing with authorised unpriced work, negotiated changes would normally be accommodated through a formal change control process by adjusting the authorised unpriced work budget balance remaining in undistributed budget, distributing negotiated budgets to the performance measurement baseline for effort that hasn't started yet, understanding that when you do allocate that budget, sometimes there might be a negotiation loss, or the final outcome of that negotiation might be different to the unauthorised work that was, or the budget that was actually anticipated for that unpriced work. A combination of the above. In some cases, the adjustment to the performance measurement baseline may have to be effected against budgets for completed work. That's worst case scenario, if that's how the change was negotiated and the MR was not authorised. So the performance measurement baseline, against which all the cost and schedule performance will be measured, can be broken down into a number of chunks, if you like, or different cost types. So there's the overall contract price, which is made up of the performance measurement baseline and management reserve. The performance measurement baseline, the majority of it would normally sit in control accounts, particularly for a fairly well-defined project. And those control accounts would be made up of work packages and planning packages. In some cases, there may be what's referred to as summary level planning packages. And these are basically fairly large planning packages that are so uncertain they haven't even been allocated to a control account manager as yet. So if you like, you could imagine that they're still allocated to the project manager, and they're fairly uncertain in the future. And then, as we discussed earlier, there's also undistributed budget. So this is typically, undistributed budget should not exist for very long, but this would typically be budget that might be in the process of getting released for a negotiated change or for a negotiation process for authorised unpriced work, for example. The idea is that as soon as possible, once that negotiation is settled, that undistributed budget would be allocated to the appropriate control account. Management reserve. As we mentioned earlier, it's a budgetary amount that's typically set aside for project management. It's actually different to contingency. It's used for work that's within the scope of the project, but it's considered by PM or senior management to be beneficial for the program, portfolio or organisation. The management reserve is typically controlled by the project manager via the change control process, and it should be tracked using some form of MR tracking log. Okay, so management reserve. So there's a number of different reasonable or typical uses for management reserve. To provide budget for work that is within the scope of the project, but outside of the budget for control accounts, for example, or for program or portfolio level changes that are outside of the control of the project manager that are going to have an impact on the project. So some examples of this might be a sudden change in the internal labour rate within the organisation, for example, or an ERP implementation or another internal project within the company that affects the project but couldn't have been anticipated by the project manager. Now, it's important to remember that the use of MR is subject to formal change control, so it should still sit under the change control process. It's not part of the performance measurement baseline. It's not part of earned value management calculations. And MR shouldn't just be used to offset variances. So if there's troubled areas on the project, it's not about buffering them up with a bit of MR or anything like that. There should be a really decent criteria about external problems that have come and have impacted the project that need to be allocated for. So basically the performance measurement baseline, it's that time-phased plan for measuring performance. The performance measurement baseline equals the distributed budgets plus the undistributed budgets, so it's pretty simple, and the majority of the budget should be in the distributed budget pretty much throughout the project. The performance measurement baseline does not include MR, so MR sits separately to the PMB. Undistributed budget is budget associated with specific work scope or contract changes that have not been assigned to a control account or summary level planning package. So this is also under formal change control, and it's tracked in the undistributed budget log. Undistributed budget is part of the planned value calculation at the bottom line of the project, and it's not included in the individual control account metrics. So it's budget that exists within the PMB but hasn't yet been allocated to control accounts because negotiations over changes are still in lieu. So undistributed budget functions as a temporary holding, typically 1 to 2 reporting periods maximum, for contractual changes that are authorised too late in the accounting period to properly plan and reflect in the PMB or the control account. So a budget might be allocated, but we haven't had the opportunity yet to distribute that to a detailed planning level within the PMB. UB also tends to function as a holding place for authorised unpriced work, as mentioned earlier, prior to that negotiation having been completed. So distributed budget, so this is the typical sort of budgets that we deal with in a fairly known situation where we aren't dealing with any complex changes, uncertainty and those sorts of things. So the distributed budget consists of those budgets allocated to control accounts, which ideally should be the entire budget. Within a control account, near-term contractual effort is planned within work packages, whereas future effort, which we know might be subject to change, or where detailed planning information isn't yet available, is typically planned in planning packages. We don't want to plan out detail that we still think is fairly uncertain because it's just going to create rework and lots of rework for the project controls team and uncertainty for the project manager. Planning packages are converted to work packages prior to the start of work, and as we start to know that detail and we have a higher confidence level that we can lock it in. So this approach allows for timely establishment of a meaningful performance measurement baseline. So you can imagine if you're at the start of the project, you want to get the plan in place quickly, you want to get stakeholders in line. It becomes particularly difficult if you're trying to plan out detail at the far end of the project when there's so much uncertainty. It's not reasonable to know how all that's going to play out. So it actually expedites that establishment of the PMB as well. So WBS level control accounts. So a control account, as we've mentioned earlier, is the major control point for cost summaries, responsibility assignment, scope direction, and corrective action planning. They're basically the management control point, or they're the nexus where schedule, scope, and cost is combined with a responsible manager for performance reporting, comparing actual costs with earned value, comparing earned value with the planned value. So basically within a control account, the following functions are performed and integrated: work definition, work authorization, budgeting, scheduling, performance measurement, performance analysis, change control, and of course forecasting as well. Now work packages often coincide with control accounts, so often work packages are that same point where there's one responsible manager and actual costs do roll up to that point. These contain discrete segments of work, sometimes below, sometimes at the control account level. They'll include a brief description of the work, often taken from your WBS dictionary, for example. They'll have a start and end date, a completion milestone. They'll have a method of measurement for measuring work in progress, a time phase budget that can be expressed in direct labour, hours, dollars. They may be made up of material costs, other direct cost or subcontract dollars, typically one, not a mixture. And they can be either, they can have an earned value measurement technique that might be discrete, so there might be a discrete defined method for measuring percent complete, or it could be a level of effort type. So if it's a work package for management, for example, the The performance measurement technique can be just based on the expiration of time, for example. But as much as possible, particularly if it is for discrete work, the ideal would be to have a discrete performance measurement technique. The other aspect is the duration of a work package. Particularly for a discrete measurable work package, would typically be a relatively short span of time. You wouldn't want it to be more than 1 to 2 periods for a discrete work package, whereas some of the level of effort or apportioned effort type work packages that tend to be for management, it's okay to have them spanning a longer period of time because you want them to be as low maintenance as possible. You don't want that to be a management focus area, and you want it to be low maintenance for the project controls team. So planning packages are very similar to work packages. They're basically reflecting a future segment of work where there's a fair amount of uncertainty. So at this point, where we have a planning package, we think it's quite likely to change. We only know a little bit about it, so we're not quite ready to lock it in for performance measurement yet. They're basically a budget and time placeholder within the control account to represent known work that we know we need budget for, but we're not quite sure about the detail. So a planning package does have a firm budget, it does have an estimated start and completion date, and it does have a scope of work. As the work becomes clearly defined, or as we work our way through the project, the planning packages are sequentially converted into work packages before the work is authorised and the work starts. The sum of the work packages and the planning packages within any control account could not exceed the control account budget. So the idea is the control account has a budget, and that's divided up and allocated to the planning packages and work packages within that control account. So once again, we've already covered it in the first module, but it's all about this rolling wave concept. If you can see the work packages in the lighter blue, and the planning packages in the medium coloured blue, if you like, and time now, you can see in the vicinity of time now, we're surrounded by work packages. So at any given moment, the work that's been authorised and the work that people should be working on is all exists in work packages. Looking forwards, you can see there's an array of planning packages, and as time expires and as we get closer to those planning packages, the idea is that they're broken out into specific work packages. Earned value techniques are assigned, control account managers are assigned, and they're tracked and measured in the same way as work packages. So in summary of work packages and planning packages, work packages are the basic building blocks of the control accounts used for planning and controlling measuring performance. They make up the detail that builds up the control account. So it's basically a summary of work packages and planning packages, but all of the actual performance is being done within the work packages. The sum of the work packages and planning packages will equal the overall budget for the control account, but all the work that's being earned and all the actual costs that are coming through against the work packages. Now the control account plan basically describes the authorised scope, budget and schedule for the control account. It summarises the performance measurement baseline and forecast for the work package, and it demonstrates the way that they're integrated into a time-phased budget. Low-level detail can be prepared by the control account manager or the CAM, typically showing time-phased planning of the tasks and resources and their associated budget for the control account. So this is usually done through a cost and resource loaded schedule. These control account plans provide a brief work package and milestone descriptions that enable the CAM to clarify and differentiate the content of each work package. And each work package and planning package has a firm budget, an estimated start and completion dates, and a statement of work. So it's very clear what the scope of work is, what the expectation is from a budget and a schedule perspective. A control account work authorization. This basically confirms that agreement between the control account manager or project engineer and the project manager to accomplish that plan. It provides the authorization to proceed with the work, and the project manager uses the control account plan or work authorization to provide planning guidance to the control account managers, and then when work is completed to document and delegate that work to control account managers. The work authorization process involves identification of completeness of packages, so that work packages can be closed once work is complete and costs have settled against the work package. The work authorisation process may also involve permitting certain people or costs to be booked to given work packages. So another important aspect of this planning process is setting rules of performance, rules of credit as they're sometimes called. It's about having a defined and documented methods to objectively identify and quantify project performance. So earned value is all about objectively measuring the physical accomplishment of activity. So how are we going to measure this activity? So during the development of the estimate and the schedule, that's the right time to be thinking about what is the earned value technique that we're going to use. What are the rules of performance measurement that are going to be utilised in execution to measure performance of these different work scopes? So there are a number of different performance measurement methods to measure progress and to calculate earned value. Firstly, discrete effort. So discrete effort is typically for finite, well-defined, quantifiable tasks. So construction tasks being the simplest example. So if there's known quantities, if you have an approved for construction drawing, it's fairly easy to have a takeoff and a very specific quantity-based measurement system that you can use. Sometimes it's not as clear as that, and summary level type methods will be used. So for example, for fairly small packages, it's common to use a start-finish type formula, so where once the particular work package is started, it can be given a particular pro rata or a percentage of completion, and when it's finished it can be given 100% complete. That might be divided up on a 0 to 100 basis, 50-50, 25 to 75, whatever is deemed appropriate. Another one is incremental milestones, which is probably a better system than the start-finish system. It tends to be for longer duration type work, where there'll be a pre-agreement or an agreement made that for these types of packages of work, particular milestones are given a particular percentage of the overall weighting for that work package. So a typical example for that would be design packages, for example, where there might be different criteria or different weightings that are assigned as the design process goes through to maturity. Different percentages can be assigned for each design phase of that work package. Milestone with percent complete is based on detailed steps or hours necessary to complete a task within a work package. So this can be fairly similar to the incremental milestone, except that as you're progressing towards those milestones, you're also able to claim progress as well, based on the expected resourcing or effort in getting between those milestones. And equivalent or actual units complete, or a physical quantity account. So this is the ideal situation where you're actually able to measure quantities on site, for example, and you can allocate progress based on cubic metres, square metres, or linear metres of pipe installation, whatever the particular quantity is that you happen to be installing or constructing. Okay, so they're the discrete effort. That's the ideal situation. There's a number of other work packages that have to be where we have to use more rubbery approximations, if you like, of the effort. And the two typical examples of those are apportioned effort, which is where we basically say, okay, there's support activity that has to happen on this project. We're not quite sure exactly what it is. We're not quite sure exactly what tasks they're going to be doing, but we're going to apportion that as a percentage of the overall construction or discrete work that's happening on a project. So a typical example of these might be quality assurance inspections on a construction site, or support from a safety team on a construction site, where you're not sure exactly what they're going to be doing, but you know that there's going to be a level of effort that is supporting, or a proportion of effort that is supporting the overall construction program. A level of effort is fairly similar. It's once again, it's for support activity, but it tends to be used for time-based activities. So where you have for example, it might be a project management office or something like that, where you can fairly predictably predict over time what their effort is going to be or what their resourcing requirements are going to be, and it's fairly independent of the amount of work that might be happening elsewhere on the project. So going into a little bit more detail on the discrete effort techniques, the start and finish or fixed formula method that we spoke about earlier. So it basically earns a proportion of the work, as I said earlier, based on an agreed allocation to the start and the finish milestone of activities. It's really used for short-term activities. So the idea is that if it's a really short-term activity, all we really need to know whether it's start and finished. We don't really need to allocate at any finer level of detail than that, because it's not really worth the effort. And so common splits, as I mentioned earlier, might be 0, 100, 50, 50, 20, 75, basically based on the needs or desires of the project. The key element being that it's agreed up front. So it's fairly clear, it makes it transparent to everybody that it can't be subject to manipulation or any of those sorts of things, and the rules are established up front. The advantages of this method being that it's really suitable for short-term, smaller work packages, requires minimal effort, and it's very easy to update. The disadvantages, it could be the source of false variances, for example. If you can imagine at the start of a project, if you had a large number of activities, and if you had all of these activities earning 50% when they started, you could suddenly have a spike or an artificial increase in the amount of earned value on a project, particularly if those activities weren't closing out very quickly. So going into a little bit more detail on the incremental milestones method, this is the technique that's used particularly when you have a repeatable set of activities or a repeatable type of work packages. You can set up a predefined criteria for how much progress is claimed on those work packages. And as you can see on this particular example, for example, we've allocated 15% for received at site, cumulatively 30% for setting, 50% for alignment, 70% for installation of internals, 80% for testing, and turnover 100%. So by setting those criteria, as the work package progress is made, it's fairly clear and transparent what the rules are and what the criteria are for claiming progress. The advantages of this method is that you have objective, clear, measurable milestones, which the customer, who's obviously paying, typically prefers. The disadvantage is that it doesn't allow for partial credit for in-process work, and it requires a bit of detailed milestone planning, which I think is a good thing. But it's basically, so the gaps between those milestones, there's no credit given for those. But typically, if you have a lot of these happening at once, via swings and roundabouts, the credit tends to get claimed, and it tends to work out quite well. Milestone percent complete. This is very similar to the last technique used. The only difference being that you actually can claim that partial credit as you're working towards each of the milestones or completion of the activities. So this might be used where the packages are a little bit bigger or a little bit more unique than the ones that you've used for the milestone technique. So basically the work package is defined in terms of sequential milestones. These milestones are assigned a proportion of the overall work package budget. A percentage complete is assessed for each milestone, and those percent completes contribute towards the overall earned value. The advantages being you have objective measurable milestones. It allows for partial credit. It can reduce excessive schedule detail by representing numerous activities as internal milestones within one package. And the disadvantage being that it requires a CAM assessment of percent complete, but once again that's also an advantage. And last but not least, we have a very simplistic representation here of equivalent or actual units. So this is often described as equivalent units complete. So it's often used in manufacturing environments, but it's also used in construction environments, particularly where there's a repeatable process that's happening. It basically involves applying a weighting to each step in a process, or in a construction environment, it might be assigning equal weightings per particular units of achievement. So this could be linear meters installed, cubic meters poured, square meters cleared. Whatever the particular quantity is that you're installing or measuring on a project, it can have a value, and measurement can be done by objectively measuring the actual units completed on site. So in this example here, for example, a very simplistic version of a work package that has 20 units. It's observed at the end of a period that 11 of them have been completed, so the percentage complete would be 11 over 20 equals 55% complete. So moving on to the next technique, the apportion method, which is once again one of these more subjective methods. So it's when we have a support activity that is typically in some level of proportion to the amount of construction or the actual base task that it's supporting. If it's in proportion to that, we tend to use the apportion method. So basically, for example, quality control would be a typical one that you might use a apportion method for. If it was agreed that the quality control hours were determined to be roughly 20% of the total construction hours, and construction takes 100 hours, the quality control task would be budgeted at basically 20 hours or 20% of construction. The percent complete for the apportioned task would always be the same as the percent complete for the base task or the construction task. And we could measure how we're tracking from a cost perspective by comparing the earned value with the actual costs that were coming through. So the actual costs aren't apportioned, the actual costs are collected through the cost collection system in the normal way. The advantages are that it streamlines monthly performance measurement. It's an appropriate method for work packages which mirror the established cost estimating relationships. So the idea, if this is the way the work's estimated, it's really handy to also apply that in an earned value sense as well. And the disadvantage of this method is that it requires a CAM assessment of the percent complete for the parent, but fundamentally the CAM should be performing that percent complete of the direct activities anyway, so that's actually an advantage. A level of effort, this is the other rubbery one, and we tend to use this for some of those support activities that are time-based or independent of the amount of activity that might be happening on the direct project, but just tend to be a linear spread of time. Earned value is always equal to the planned value on these, so there'll never be a schedule variance with these activities, but there will be actual cost collection, so you can identify cost variances on these types of activities. So it's typically used on things such as program management or project control support for a project that's in delivery. Okay, integrated baseline reviews. So, but integrated baseline reviews are a really, really valuable process to have on your within your own value management system. So it's basically a formal review that's conducted by the customer and project manager and project team. It's a review of the performance measurement baseline. It usually happens following contract award, and it's about verifying the technical or the scope of the PMB and the appropriateness of it, the accuracy of resources, budgets and schedules, and the ground rules and assumptions that have been baked into that plan. So the objective of an IBR is to establish and maintain a mutual understanding of the baseline and the risks that have been inherently incorporated within that PMB. So it's typically conducted within 6 months of a contract award and is often continued on an ongoing basis as a surveillance review or some similar type of review. If you remember earlier, we spoke about establishing the PMB. The better your collaboration is, and the more that or the better you've documented your assumptions and understood your scope of work, obviously the more robust that PMB is going to be, and the better that it's going to stand up to one of these IBRs or baseline reviews. Okay, over the target baseline. This is another, I guess, quirky type of earned value management technology that's used to describe a particular scenario. It's a fairly rare scenario, so it's not one that's worth putting too much emphasis on in terms of the material, but to have that awareness of it is the main thing. So the over the target baseline is basically the sum of the contract budget base, so the overall contract value, and any recognised overrun. So it's the available contract budget for the remaining, it occurs when the available contract budget for the remaining work is decidedly insufficient. So at this time, the contractor might put up their hand and say, we have an over the target baseline. And it may result in formal reprogramming, for example. So the typical conditions that apply would be that the project completion work is less than 85% complete. So if the project was so close to being complete, you might say it's really not worth having this formal reprogramming process. And you'd think that at least 6 months of substantial work remain after the programming, so that you're actually going to get the benefit of that formal reprogramming. And I guess the other thing is you'd need guidelines in place to implement the change. So you need to understand the extent of reprogramming that's occurring, what WBS elements are affected, the base month for the reprogramming. So it's really important to understand, okay, we're going to reprogram from where, from next month end, from this month end, and making all of those decisions. Understanding the reprogramming ground rules, the performance measurement during the implementation of the reprogramming effort. So that's a really important one. So if it's going to take us a month to perform this reprogramming effort, what are we going to be reporting on as far as performance goes during that month? And re-establishing the management reserve. Okay, so that's the overall earned value management philosophy, and we've spoken a little bit about planning versus scheduling. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now about the relationship between scheduling and planning. So basically, a well thought out plan is sort of the key to the development and implementation of earned value management. It's about identifying, setting goals and objectives, defining the scope, responsibilities and priorities to the appropriate level of detail, establishing a rolling wave plan. So that's part of the planning process itself. So early on in a project, it's about consciously saying we're going to engage this rolling wave planning concept on this project as part of the planning process. Identifying and planning resources, identifying work processes and procedures, preparing resource cost and schedule estimates, establishing budgets for monitoring and control, and establishing the project team and aligning team members towards the goals of the PMB, and establishing a planning culture. This is a really, really important one and has such a huge effect on the overall outcome of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve with EV. So it's about understanding where your organisation is and the people, where they are at with their project controls maturity at the moment, establishing an agreement with the project team about, well, this is how we're going to do things on this project, and getting that commitment and understanding from people right from the start, because trying to implement or trying to change the culture halfway through an implementation of EV on a project is going to be particularly difficult, but doing it up front makes it a lot easier. So the major elements of that sort of overall higher level planning process is about summarising goals, identifying the scope of work, time planning, cost planning, allocating resources, planning for different functions, and this is a really important aspect as well. So looking at the project scope, looking at it from the project manager's viewpoint, but also cutting across the project as well. So looking at it from a safety perspective, an environment perspective and a quality perspective, and making sure, from a safety perspective, all of the right audits are happening. There's the right level of support from a safety perspective. The safety function is happy with the overall plan. From an environmental perspective, the same thing, making sure that the right hold points might be in place, the right audits are in place. Quality, making sure the right witness and hold points have been identified in the schedule, and that the quality function is happy with the overall flow of the program as well. Risk and contingency planning is really important as well. So performing that risk assessment, understanding what the risks are and saying, okay, well, these are the assumptions we're going to make in terms of the overall plan, documenting that and allocating contingency as needed. Gaining stakeholder commitment, another key aspect. So if you haven't got that stakeholder buy-in, if you haven't got that ownership from the project manager and the control account managers or the project engineers, they're not going to remain committed, and it's going to be hard to engage with them about how the project's performing down the track. And of course, reviewing, testing, revising and updating. There is no such thing as a perfect plan. The PMB will not remain the PMB throughout the duration of the project. It's going to be changed, it's going to go through iterations, it's going to be revised. Know that at the start of the project. Make sure people don't have that expectation, and work with the team to treat that PMB and that project schedule as something that's going to continuously be iterated towards the success of the project. So there's an ACE recommended practice on the major elements of planning. It's AACE RP 14R90. It's responsibility and required skills of a project planning and scheduling professional. It's a really handy one to read because it provides all of those aspects of planning and scheduling skills feed into the EVM process as well. So the results of effective planning is that you have a good basis for team development, alignment, communication and problem resolution, identifies risks and potential mitigation plans, identifies management focus needs. It enables you to have management by exception. So if you have a good plan in place, it's fairly easy to identify things that are falling off plan, which means that everything that's on plan can be sort of off the radar, and the elements that need management attention can be given management attention. It forms the basis for baseline development, monitoring, forecasting, and even replanning to accommodate change. So if you've documented what the basis was for your original plan, when a new change comes along, it's fairly easy to identify where the assumptions might be different to your original plan. And so it's all about the opportunity for influence plan. So you may have seen this visualization, which basically provides a very sort of conceptual representation in the project life cycle of where you have the most opportunity to influence the costs on the project, or the value that's generated from a project. And the brown dotted line basically represents where your expenditures are the greatest. So you can see from this diagram just the lower costs at the front end of the project life cycle and the higher ability to influence the outcomes of the project. Help reinforce this whole concept of that front end planning. The more time that's put into planning at the front end of the project, the better the outcomes for the overall project are likely to be. So planning, the planning being this sort of overarching high level planning, we then break that down into scheduling, which is the more detailed time phasing of that plan. Once we've locked that in, created a performance measurement baseline, it's about controlling, which is that tracking, assessing how we're going, measuring how we're going, and feeding that feedback back into the planning process so the plan can continuously be adjusted. So that concept is now broken down into a little bit more detail here, where we have that planning process at the front end, developing a more detailed schedule which results in a freezing of the baseline, and then that controlling aspect, which is this performance measurement, measuring earned value, actual costs, feeding that performance back to the project and controlling the project. Planning being basically to review the job requirements and responsibilities so that an acceptable course of action, the plan, can be agreed upon in an optimum manner, whereas scheduling is implementing that project in more detail and monitoring progress towards those results. So, planning being more about strategy development, whereas scheduling is the tactical execution of that plan. So the budgeting process establishes a mean for developing and tracking the scope, schedule, cost, and risk mitigation goals for all of that contractually authorised work. But one of the key criteria for establishing an EVMS system is that the scope is really well defined and that the schedule and cost are integrated and baselined. So the baseline is what the cost and schedule performance is measured against down the track. So the schedule baseline represents the planned sequence of project activities and their resources against a timeline, and it provides the basis for measuring and reporting schedule performance, right? And that schedule baseline is then integrated with the cost information as well. Whereas risk management is the practice of systematically assessing the risks and determining the courses of action. So exposure to risk and risk mitigation plans has to be considered when building contingency into that project plan, the project schedule and the estimate. So the estimate for developing the cost baseline includes contingency, and contingency includes those three categories that we spoke about earlier: the estimate contingency, the technical risk contingency, and the schedule contingency. So the PMB is the time phase budget plan, against all of which that contract performance will be measured. It doesn't include the management reserve, but it includes all of the technical scope and contingency. So in review, that work breakdown structure, it's the framework that we use to chunk up the scope and allocate all of those cost and schedule and contingency. And it basically enables the integration of scope, schedule and cost. So that WBS, or that control account language, your financial system will be able to speak in that language, and your schedule system should be able to speak in that language. The control account can have one or more of the WBS elements assigned to it, but it's assigned to one particular person, a control account manager, to be responsible for that performance. And the control account becomes the accountable control point for monitoring cost and schedule. The work packages might contain discrete segments of work below the control account level, and they might control detailed planning in order to finish the work within the control account. So a work package can have very detailed activities within it, using different performance measures that then roll up into that control account. And as we mentioned, the planning packages identify work that will eventually be broken down into a work package but hasn't necessarily been broken down yet. So it tends to represent medium or far-term work with a budget, with a time frame, but not yet broken down so that it's going to be measured for performance. Now, there are two major contract types or categories that it's really important to be mindful of as an earned value professional, because they have different risk associated with them. And earned value actually supports both projects and adds a lot of value in both scenarios. But in cost reimbursable projects, the value of earned value is significantly higher because it enables you to very quickly measure how efficiently or how effectively the work's being performed. So you can raise red flags fairly early and help ensure that there's, or drastically reduce the risk of significant cost overruns. So in a cost reimbursable project, all costs are borne by the buyer or the owner, the client. So typically the supplier or contractor, it could be seen that they have an incentive to actually increase costs, because the higher the costs, the more money they receive. So by applying earned value principles and assigning a budget to the work quickly, the owner who's wearing that risk will very quickly be able to identify if they're exposed to significant cost overruns or if there's a risk that they will be. So typical cost reimbursable models include cost reimbursable no fee, cost sharing models, cost plus incentive fees, cost plus award fees, all sorts of different arrangements of cost sharing and fee sharing, and of course simple time and materials where 100% is passed through. The other sort of model where the risk is, or generally tends to be borne by the contractor or the supplier, is firm fixed price, or lump sum as it's commonly called. Some of the descriptions of this, or some of the models within this sort of category, include fixed price plus with escalation, or fixed price with an incentive fee. So there are variants, but even in these situations, there's a lot of value that can be gained by using earned value management techniques, particularly for measuring things such as labour productivity and some of those sorts of things, which might be hidden if you're just looking at the typical value of work using dollars, or a value placed on the dollars associated with particular work elements. So what are some of the inputs that we use with our EVM systems? So there's, I guess, depending on the contract, there might be a number of minimum requirements that are defined, and that I guess can be regarded as mandatory. And there might also be optimum requirements, or nice to haves, or different ideas for different KPIs or things that can be measured on the project that help enhance success on the project that may not necessarily be a contractual requirement. So basically the contract is the baseline for planning typically. So it's really important for an EVM practitioner to understand the contract documents, particularly as they relate to the scope of work and the definition of the scope of work. They might have particular rules in place for change management, for example. It's really good to be mindful of those. A number of different contract terms and conditions, different risk allocations and things like that for particular conditions that might be encountered on the project. Scheduling and reporting requirements are typically defined in the contract as well. And in some cases you might find that all of that information isn't available in the contract in a clean way, and so it might mean that you have to go through earlier proposals, estimates, correspondence and other pre-contract information just to try to tease some of that information out. Establishing a planning culture. So this is certainly one of the most challenging areas in project controls, and it really so much of the success that you have in setting up an earned value management system depends on the culture of the environment that you're in. So it's really important at the front end to understand that culture and explore that culture and gain that commitment from the project team as to what type of a planning culture you want to have on a project. And as much as possible, if you can have success with the project manager and above in obtaining that rigorous planning culture, the benefits that come from earned value are significantly larger than if you don't establish that culture. So it's about planning being valued as a proactive approach to problem solving, helping stakeholders see the benefits and the early warning systems and the traceability that they can have from following these processes. It encourages open communication and accountability for managers. So there might be a lot of perception from managers that they're going to be suddenly subject to more scrutiny than normal and some of these sorts of things. So it's really important to establish that culture where performance problems are identified as opportunities to help each other, to support the project and to solve problems. And some of those softer skills approaches help to get a greater acceptance and a greater adoption of earned value management. So that gets on to the next point, which is no fear of blame. So it's not about blaming particular people or individuals for performance problems. It's just about helping understand why things are performing in a certain way so that if needed, different decisions can be made or resources allocated to help. The benefits are exactly as I mentioned, so sharing performance problems and issues, so teams being able to do that, teams being able to identify that up at a project or a program level so that people can provide support and assistance. It provides clear communication conduits to stakeholders. So having this EVM in place, it creates a common language where people have this common method they use for describing cost performance problems, schedule performance problems. WBS elements between different projects might have a certain similarity to them that helps create this sort of performance language within a project as well. There's less surprises during execution. So if you're using EV, typically you can identify problems much quicker than you could if you're not using earned value. As I mentioned, help and support can be provided between the teams more readily. And post-completion reviews on projects. So there's a lot of talk about lessons learned and knowledge management and things like this on projects these days. There's no better system for automatically creating that historical record and that footprint of how a project tracked and what the problems were throughout the duration of the project than by having EVM in place, where you're systematically every month reporting what was going wrong, what was going well, and what's been happening cumulatively on the project. So how handy is that to be able to hand that over at the end of a project as part of a lessons learned system? Which kind of gets on to the next area about documenting policies and procedures. So suddenly you have this proactive problem-solving risk identification process where you're proactively incorporating policies and processes. You have a standard of practice. You have operational level plans for your project managers. The benefits are suddenly you're sharing and evolving your best practices. You have more and more consistency of standardisation between stakeholders and projects. So the classic example is it's really common in project controls for there to be a bit of conflict between commercial teams and project controls teams, for example, or even in some cases differences of reporting between project scheduling teams and cost control teams. Earned value gets all of those teams on the same page. So suddenly everybody has to agree to the same scope of work. The same rules of credit have to be agreed between the commercial team and the earned value team. So in order to do that, teams are going to be using the same language. So it really forces that alignment of structures and processes as well. So for example, claim schedules can start to be broken out in a format that starts to resemble the WBS breakdown structure. So it's a really good tool for starting to fuse and enhance that communication between different project teams. Provides, of course, a baseline for monitoring and controlling the project and those post-completion reviews. So planning tools. So there's a number of different tools that we use to enhance planning. So firstly, it's organisational policies and operating procedures. Model plans to adopt to the current project. So you might have some templates and things like that that can be adapted to suit the needs of a particular project. It's really handy to have checklists in place, so you might have a baselining checklist where you identify a number of the activities. Helps make it simple for people to provide a bit of assurance that they've gone through the right thought process for the baseline. Historical databases can be very handy. Codes of account structured to aid the monitoring, updating and forecasting. So if there's existing codes of account that might exist within the financial team, once again, having earned value in place really encourages that dialogue and helps get that alignment between the financial code of accounts, or at least understand the mapping between the financial code of accounts and the earned value, or the WBS breakdown system that tends to be used for performance reporting. Great for benchmarking and benchmarking of projects and creating that footprint and that database for future projects, particularly if you're in a multi-project organisation. And commercial handbooks and software programs are obviously very handy, particularly software programs for running and integrating a lot of the data. So resource considerations and constraints. So they should be considered from a number of perspectives. So how much money will be available versus how much money is required. How many people will be available versus how much is required. How much equipment will be available compared to what's required. What locations, what site access will we have for equipment at particular times, and what clashes might there be with other equipment. Resource planning, identifying key or driving resources and priorities. Studying the resource availability. Identifying resource limits and constraints. Optimising resources as much as possible. Reviewing and documenting the resource plan, and maintaining a historical database. Shareholder input and feedback. So first and foremost, this earned value process is really it's all about stakeholders and communication, because as I've mentioned, this is really an integration piece that cuts across many different areas. So it's really important to engage early and understand the goals and objectives of the number of different stakeholders if we're expecting buy-in from different groups into the earned value process, it's really important to engage and understand their goals and objectives early. So the stakeholder demands and influences can have a significant impact on the way that the project is executed, but can also have an impact on the way that, or your ability to be able to extract data from people during execution as well, which all ultimately can have an effect on the visibility of reports and the effectiveness or the productivity on the project. So the idea is with stakeholders getting their input as much as possible during the planning process, ideally even engaging contractors and getting contractor input into the planning process, though sometimes that can be difficult with certain probity rules and things like that. But yeah, and then getting the input during the planning and then feedback during scheduling and control. So scheduling and control is about continuous feedback back to the stakeholders, incorporating their feedback and rolling it back into the plan. So stakeholder engagement is basically the key. Planning inputs themselves, so there's the project planning basis, the estimating basis or the basis of estimate, resourcing quantities information, organisational breakdown structures, organisational charts, execution strategy documents are very helpful, management plans if they exist, so project management plans, contract management plans, project execution plans, design management plans. As much as possible, being able to elicit all that information really helps inform the project planning process. Looking at alternative scope options, understanding what the chart of account is for actual cost collection, understanding the values of the project, what's important to the project, whether it's more about engaging with stakeholders or whether it's more a time-critical project where there might be particular consequences if the project's late, but understanding what the project's sensitive to so that what matters to the project is being really measured well and measured closely through the EVM system. It's important to digest as much as possible historical project information, understand what information is needed for analysis, and having a process in place for changes as they start to come through the system. A lot of the outputs of the planning is comparisons of resource availability versus the needs, having a basis for project control plans, and having a basis for asset planning as well. So the goal for the project planning requirements should be to be scalable. So for particular projects or the specifications that are developed, it really depends on the size and complexity of the project, the type of contract and the type of project. So we mentioned earlier the type of project for a cost reimbursable project, for example. Having a fairly tight earned value management system becomes a bigger priority and the benefit is even greater, whereas other projects it might not be so mandatory. And time constraints as well, so considering internal and external time constraints. So within the specification or the project control specification, we need to define what's required for project scheduling from an owner's perspective. So ensuring that the owner's plan meets the owner's goals and objectives, monitoring the contractor's execution plan and progress so that it's informing the owner's plan, and the contractor's plan should become a basis to exert control when problems are identified. From the contractor's perspective, it's about defining the plan to meet those contractual requirements, defining the means and the methods of executing the actual work itself, integrating vendors and subcontractors and suppliers' plans into their plan, and providing a baseline for them that becomes meaningful for controlling the work. It's really handy within the specification or the requirements to also identify who is responsible for the project schedule. So the contractor prepares and maintains the schedule. What about their subcontractors? Is there a requirement to flow down particular reporting requirements to subcontractors, and understanding and specifying that as much as possible? Is a dedicated competent scheduler required? So more and more these days I'm seeing requirements for ACE certification as one example of a competency requirement for planners, schedulers and earned value practitioners on projects, and specifying what are the agreed performance measures or progress measurement techniques. There might also be requirements for owner reviews. We mentioned IBRs before, or other different surveillance type reviews. And so specification elements might include all sorts of things such as planning and scheduling requirements, baseline submission durations and requirements, review requirements, WBS requirements. So it's fairly common for an owner or a client to have a level of detail that they require as mandatory for work breakdown structure, and it might be so that this can fit more seamlessly within the owner's work breakdown structure. So typical elements might include design, procure, construct, commission, and then broken down into different areas or different disciplines. But it's most common that at the more detailed level, it'll be driven by the contractor and the means and methods they plan to use for executing the work. It's also important to look at schedule resourcing requirements, schedule health requirements, and this is a key one. So including schedule health requirements just to help provide assurance that the technical schedule aspects or the linking and the logic that's been baked into the schedule is robust. Frequency and timing of data dates and submissions of updates is a really critical one. So earned value reporting really requires really good timing and sequencing of the inputs, both the progress from schedules, the actual costs and accruals that come through from the finance process, so that you've got an apples and apples comparison of progress versus actual costs, progress versus planned, that's automatically getting produced with each progress report. Schedule development requirements and review requirements, phasing requirements, particular milestones or hold points might need to be identified, And as I mentioned earlier, identifying that change management process so that it's all fairly clear up front what the requirements are for the different groups. Specification may also include a basis for periodic payment applications. So this is a really key area in earned value management, is getting that alignment between the claim process and the earned value management structure that's been set up within the EVM system. Requirements for the scheduler's experience, software compatibility requirements, updating for scope changes, delays and impacts, variance reporting requirements, so putting a requirement on a contractor to report particular thresholds of performance, and specifying how the EVM system might be used in claims and disputes, and how extensions of times and things such as that might be supported by the schedule. So the schedule should know how sequencing is affected by the phased completion of turnover, for example, particular interfacing and sequencing of separate contractors and contractors, work performed by others or by the owner or others, contract milestone limitations such as milestones, workday or nighttime working restrictions, work week restrictions. There might be early owner furnished materials that have to be specified in advance within a particular range. Interfaces and functional groups, for example, safety audits, QA, QC inspection, hold points, environmental audits and other inspections. The schedule should also be informed by limitations by owner occupancy and use, so site restrictions or access restraints such as permits, resource limitations and availability, weather and seasonal impact requirements and what assumptions have been made in the schedule for those, provisions for scope changes, submittal and review process, demonstration that safety considerations have been incorporated within the schedule, starting and commissioning processes, handover deliverables and documentation. Handover deliverables and documentation being a really key one because they're often something that's neglected towards the end of the job. So having a process in place where they're allocated within the schedule, within the work breakdown structure, and given a weighting so that there is that increased incentive to close those out towards the end of the job as well. So potential specification conflicts. So it's important to raise these, and these are really good things to be aware of up front. Particularly, I mentioned earlier that real common tension or conflict that exists between commercial teams and project controls teams, for example. By identifying a lot of these potential conflicts up front, it really helps ensure that things are working in sync during the execution and that the commercial teams and project controls teams are in good alignment. So one of the typical elements is, has the contractor been allowed sufficient time to collaborate and develop a credible baseline schedule? So this is a really common one. As we mentioned earlier, developing that baseline is a fairly slow and thoughtful process, and it's one that you really don't want teams rushing too much. As much as possible, you want a really robust, optimised schedule, so that once that baseline schedule, so that once that's locked in, the team have a good plan to work to, and any deviations are going to be meaningful. They're not just going to be deviations because the original plan wasn't really thought through properly. So it's really important to, if you're going to specify requirements on submitting baseline schedules, that they're not too aggressive, that they're giving adequate time for the contractor to think it through, to even collaborate with the owner or project team to come up with a well thought through plan. The reasonableness of the schedule obviously is a really important consideration as well. So one, is it meeting the required milestones, but secondly, is it credible, is it realistic? Because if it's not, let's talk about that now, let's sort that out now before we set the baseline rather than sorting it out afterwards. The approval and non-approval of the schedule, having a clear process for that, and a way for dealing with it if the contractor or the owner is not complying for some reason, having a process in place for dealing with it, ideally that's not adversarial as much as possible. If it can be collaborative, it's going to lead to that important outcome, which is a good, robust baseline schedule being set up. Another common one might be failure to involve major trade contractors or subcontractors or vendors. So as much as possible, getting the right people involved and collaborating in that early planning process. Vague or ineffective updating procedures is another classic cause of conflict, so it's really good to be explicit, make it crystal clear what is required, to what month end, what are the reporting periods, and when do we need that input. And submission, approval and incorporation of early completion schedules, logic revisions, extension of time requests and changes, having a process set up front for those as well. Okay, so we've spoken about the planning overview and in particular looking at different forms of contract and some of the things that we need to think about when we're setting up the specification or the roadmap for planning, if you like. We're now going to move into scheduling, which is more having established that plan. This is more about now, okay, how do we now implement at a detailed level the schedule for that plan? So first of all, why do we use logic schedules? So logic schedules are really fundamentally important, particularly on complex projects where it's just too difficult to put lines against a page and forecast. It's really important to have that appreciation of the knock-on effect and the interdependencies between different activities, so that when a change does occur and that change is updated in the schedule model, the knock-on effect really flows through nice and quickly. So with a schedule, all we're really doing is we're creating a model to reflect that plan that the project team has come up with and to help them foresee future problems on the project. So we want logic schedules so that those interrelationships and those connections and dependencies are identified between work steps. The logic schedule also helps us identify schedule conflicts before they become a real problem. So by breaking out the activities, representing them in a model, bubbling up problems, it helps encourage that conversation and that dialogue so that optimization process can happen. It can continuously iterate in the model so that we come up with an optimized plan way before we actually start implementing and doing things and start costing or incurring a lot of money. So it also helps us set up proper work priorities by analysis of critical path and total float. So once we've done the scheduling process, we gain a sense of how much total float or how much room for movement there is within the different activities within the program. Some of them might be very critical. These might be activities that once they slip or once they're delayed, they're going to have a big consequence, or they're going to delay the final completion of the project. Where there might be other activities where we have a bit of room to move. We know that we can relax, we can focus on the higher priority activities, and there's going to be no major consequences if we let some things slide a little bit. It's really important to use the schedule as a model to give that information to the project team so they can allocate resources and prioritise in the best way. The other thing that the schedule model does is it helps us assess the risk of achieving the schedule. There's some awesome tools out there now that allow us to incorporate range analysis and risk within the schedule to help give us a sense of the confidence level that we can have in particular dates before we set the baseline schedule. So if you're running risk workshops and you're using Monte Carlo analysis or PERT within your schedule, ideally Monte Carlo analysis, you've just got a brilliant tool for running all sorts of different scenarios, all sorts of different models and approaches to mitigating risk, exploring which ones in the model seem to yield the best outcome, and then basing your overall plan on that before you lock in the baseline. So yeah, by analysing risk, and even if you're not using the quantitative tools, just to be qualitatively to be having that dialogue and that discussion and allocating appropriate contingency into the model before you set your baseline is worth its weight in gold. Just to provide I guess a bit of an outline of scheduling, or we're going to go through the different purposes of scheduling, some of the different perspectives that different stakeholders have of the schedule, which is really important to understand. The scheduling specifications, their development and use, the input and data used in building a schedule model, creating schedule models, bar charts and PDM logic or precedence diagram method logic networks, schedule calculations and considerations, resource scheduling, change management and schedules, updating schedules for progressing and forecasting, schedule recovery and acceleration, which happens on occasion, and schedule levels and different reporting requirements and deliverables. So basically, as I've been sort of emphasising, scheduling is a set of processes that models the plan to allow monitoring, progress updating and controlling, forecasting and reporting. So the schedule is only as good as the plan, but it is fundamentally important because it is that virtual device. It's that pretend world that we use to forecast, to play in, to look at different scenarios, to communicate before things happen in the real world and cost a lot of money. So the purpose of scheduling involves model building and needs to be based on a solid plan. It's not an exact representation of how work will be planned or executed, and it's really important to help stakeholders understand that clearly. So some groups who may not be used to dealing with uncertainty, there might be a socialisation process where you help people understand it's not an exact plan, but it's a representation of how we think things will go at a particular point in time. It identifies when activities are likely to occur based on what and how the project is being delivered and who is responsible. But the key characteristics are that it's elastic, it's sensitive to change, it needs to be complete, so it needs to cover the full scope of work. It needs to be robust, so it needs to be linked and integrated properly. It needs to be understood by the project team, and it needs to be used properly. So it needs to be used for the purpose of representing the plan and communicating the detailed plan of how we're going to do the work, not misused to enhance or overstate claims or any other purposes. So in terms of integrated planning and scheduling, so scheduling is part of that iterative planning process of modelling. So essentially it's the modelling, executing, monitoring, forecasting, replanning and reporting. The schedule development process itself, it's basically an extension of the planning process that we had earlier. So having broken down the work scope into the work packages, it's then about identifying and further breaking down into activities, estimating those activity durations, identifying and modelling the relationships between those activities, assigning resources, calculating start and finish dates, and reviewing and analysing. So the different scheduling methodology, or basically the methodology involves planning, organising, and then controlling time and cost. So scheduling comes in the last aspect of that planning before we set the performance measurement baseline, and then is continuously updated throughout that controlling and updating process. It involves quantification of the discrete effort and placement of tasks in their proper relationships. So the objectives of this module are to review and understand the major functions of a schedule, understand how schedules are developed, understand scheduling concepts and the schedule elements, understand what critical path is and the critical path attributes, and scheduling or the status updating process for a schedule, and resource scheduling or allocating resources such as labour and cost to a schedule. So the two major functions, as we've touched on already, is for analysis. So, and it's a careful balance, like most things. Too much detail can be cumbersome and too difficult to maintain. Not enough detail, and you're not getting very meaningful information out of the schedule. It's very difficult to see detailed trends that are happening. So you need to find that balance of having the right level of detail where there's information that people need to know. So where it's helpful to have that extra detail is where you want to put the extra detail, but you don't want to be putting detail everywhere for the sake of detail. So if you have activities that are low risk, not likely to cause any consequence to the project, you can keep those at a fairly high level. A communication tool, so it's such a key element of all areas of project controls, but more than anything it's important that the schedule is easily read by the project team members. They need to understand what it is more so than anybody, and they must be able to convey information suited for its intended use. So if you're needing to forecast and help people understand what their remaining work is, it needs to be in a language and it needs to be represented in a way in the model that the people who are doing the work understand exactly what it is that's in front of them. So planning and scheduling principles. So I guess what is the importance of a schedule? It's basically a roadmap for the project team to accomplish the project. So it's basically telling them from where we are now, these are the steps that we plan to get to complete the project. It's a communication tool for enabling the various groups to manage their interfaces, so all the different groups understand each particular handover milestone or when each other are finishing different work fronts so that they can handle interfaces better. It's a way of conveying the total scope of work for the project, and it establishes the overall schedule parameters. It aids in determining staff requirements, providing the resource loading basis, helps identification of long lead items, and it can be built and structured according to the WBS. So some of the different people from different functions, they can still understand the schedule very clearly because it'll be structured in accordance with the WBS, which should be the same language estimators, cost controllers, contract administrators, project managers are familiar with. So back to that original question about schedule logic, or why use logic-driven schedules. This is a very simplistic representation of logic in a schedule. It's used to, this, I guess, representation identifies the relationships and dependencies between a number of work steps, A through to F, and it helps us identify schedule conflicts before they become a bigger problem, and set the work priority for critical path analysis. The project schedule is a logical representation of all of the activities in the project showing their dependency relationships. So the schedule determines the timing of operations in the project, the specific start and completion dates for the project, and it provides all project activities. Project scheduling is a process which aids managers in determining the project schedule and eventually the project schedule baseline, which becomes the performance measurement baseline. The steps being very similar to the planning for the PMB, breaking down the project activities within the control accounts, allocating the activity sequence, determining the relationships between the activities, establishing the duration of each activity, and determining the total project duration. So within each control account, the activities are broken down in this manner, and then cumulatively for the overall project duration can be determined. There's also a step within there which involves identifying the interdependencies between those different control accounts. So integrating the interdependencies between them. So the project scheduling requirements, in order to satisfy the EVMS criteria, the schedule needs to include logic ties for each activity. So that's part of the testing, I guess assuring the EVMS system is making sure that the schedule is linked appropriately. Include all key milestones and deliverables. Reflect the overall project scope and capture the technical performance requirements. This can be achieved by mapping the product breakdown structures, deliverable lists to the work breakdown structure, and in making sure that they're all captured within the WBS dictionary, and integrating the cost and technical baselines through the WBS. So making sure that the WBSs within the schedule also contain the cost and resources, and that it's consistent with the overall PMB. Okay, activity definition, so defining the activities that exist within these control accounts involves identifying and documenting the specific activities that must be performed to produce the various project deliverables within that work package. So some of the information or inputs includes the WBS and the WBS dictionary, the scope statement, historical information, constraints. There might be particular constraints in the project that need to be modelled, any assumptions, and expert judgment. So there might be cases where particular activities, it relies on the judgment of a subject matter expert. The sequencing involves identifying and documenting the order for doing the work. The activities must be sequenced accurately to support later development of a realistic and achievable schedule. The information or inputs include activity lists, deliverable lists, product descriptions, discretionary dependencies, external dependencies, and milestones. The activity relationships involves identifying and documenting the interaction or the dependencies between these different activities and the logical relationships. There's a number of different types of relationships. So the most common one is where there's a mandatory dependency where one task can't start until the predecessor is finished, for example. But there's also discretionary dependencies as well. So particularly in a construction environment, we might choose to follow a particular sequence of work because of crew availability or something like that. Whereas the reality might be that if that resource constraint were taken away, the work can actually be carried out in a different sequence. There's also external dependencies that are important to model. So having identified all of your own activities, there might be links from other activities that are being performed by other groups. The activity duration involves estimating the number of work periods to complete a particular activity. And this includes any sort of elapsed time that might happen during the scope of that activity. Some of the inputs include activity lists, constraints, understanding what assumptions you've made, particularly things such as weather, understanding what normal weather assumptions you've made will affect the duration of your activity, resource requirements, resource capabilities, and historical information is very helpful as well if you have access to it. The elements of a schedule basically include duration, both the original duration of the schedule and the remaining duration. The original duration basically being the planned estimate of the number of work periods at the beginning, whereas the remaining is basically the number of work periods currently forecast for the remaining activity or project. And the number of work periods, this depends on the way that your work periods are broken up in your schedule, but it can be hours, days, weeks or months. So activities are basically the basic elements which the project is subdivided into down at the lowest level. And these activities are then linked to create the critical path network. Each activity has a definable start and finish. It consumes time and resources. It is assignable and it's measurable. And here we have just an example screenshot there from a typical schedule including a number of activities. A milestone is a little bit different, so it's basically a zero duration activity or event which is used to denote a point in time or a particular reference or measurement. Milestones aren't true activities in that they don't consume time and resources typically, but they're often used for management summary reporting. Sometimes there might be a particular milestone or event that might have a payment associated with it or something like that, but they normally represent a point in time. Can either be a start or a finish milestone. There's a single point in time, doesn't have duration or resources normally, and is typically either yes or no, either it has been done or it hasn't. It's typically doesn't have a percentage assigned to it. So a predecessor activity is an activity that must occur before another activity. A predecessor activity occurs at the start or finish of its successor. An activity can have multiple predecessors, each with a different relationship to it. So activity A, for example, is the predecessor to activity B, and activity C, for example, is the successor to activity B. So the successor being an activity that must occur after another activity. An activity can have multiple successors as well, each with a different relationship to it. Activity calendars are quite important. So activity calendars define periods when work can or cannot occur during a project, and the length of the work week, holidays and exceptions. So relationship ties, there's basically 4 standard types of relationships. Finish to start is the most simple, common and sort of conservative type relationship, where the preceding activity has to finish prior to the successor starting. Finish to finish is where the finish of a successor activity depends on the predecessor finishing first. Start to finish is a relationship where the start of the predecessor activity controls the finish of the successor activity. So that's a very unusual type of a relationship that might be rarely included where there's some form of overlap that might be required between 2 different efforts. For example, there might be a security team on site and that are working or engaged that have a requirement that they can't leave until the new team arrives or something like that. So there might be this relationship where the start of the predecessor activity will control the finish of the successor activity. and start to start, which is a fairly common sort of relationship where the start of a predecessor activity controls the start of a successor activity. A lag is an offset or a delay that's added to that relationship. It's a delay for an activity to its successor, and it can be positive or negative. So ideally, particularly in a detailed schedule, the goal is to not use lags too much. So where possible, an activity should be defined. But sometimes if the activity is fairly trivial or it's a fairly high level schedule, there's not such a high requirement on that. But particularly where you're close to the critical path or there's a need to have a very thorough understanding of exactly what's happening along the critical path, the lag should be broken out into an actual activity. So in this case, it should be broken out into a 2-day activity, for example. So for an example here, we have a foundation with a finish to start relationship with a substructure with then a following lag to a superstructure. The lag can be applied to a number of different types of relationships. So it might be an offset or a delay. Once again, it's an offset or a delay from the predecessor to the successor. So a typical example for a finish to start with a lag delay might be applying a primer, so performing some level of painting, and then having a lag or a cure period before applying the final coat. A finish to finish type relationship with a lag relationship. So this might exist in a commissioning of equipment versus a system, or it might exist in a design package for completion of design prior to completion of drawings, where you know the drawings can't be completed until the design is finished, and you allow a 3-day period or something like that for the drawings to be closed out or updated. A start to start is another type of relationship. That might be, once again in design phase, there might be that the engineering needs to kick off and get to some level before the drafting of a particular design package might commence. The precedence diagramming method is probably not worth putting too much emphasis on, but it's just basically a technique for constructing a logic diagram using nodes to represent activities and connecting them with lines that show the logical relationships. So this is a very simple example where the square boxes represent activities and the lines represent relationships. So this is not something you'd use in your day-to-day job, but it is something that's you can use as a method for sort of manually going through the process to demonstrate that you have a good understanding of total float and critical path. The arrow diagramming method, so I've never seen the arrow diagramming method used in any sort of application in real life, so it seems to be one of these things that we review sort of from a historical perspective, but it's a method of basically building a network diagram using arrows to represent the activities and then connecting them head to tail with the nodes being the connection, the relationships being the connection between the activities. So this diagramming method shows the sequence, predecessor and successor relationships of activities. So the critical path method is the critical path is basically the longest path of activities through a project, and that determines the project completion date based on the model. And a delay in one activity delays other activities delays project completion for all activities on the critical path. Any activity on the critical path is referred to as a critical activity, and total float on the critical path equals 0, or it can be less than 0 if you're in an extreme situation where you have negative float. The critical path uses activity durations and relationships to calculate schedules, and this calculation requires 2 passes over the activities within a project, the forward pass and the backward pass as they're referred to. Okay, the forward pass. So what is a forward pass? It basically calculates an activity's early dates, or based on the links between activities, what are the earliest dates based on that logic that those activities are going to occur. They're the earliest times an activity can start and finish once its predecessors have been completed. So the calculation begins with the activities that don't have predecessors. So at the start of the project, this would be project start or something like that, and it would flow through. Basically, an early start date is calculated as the early finish date is calculated as the early start date plus the duration of the activity minus 1 day gives us the early finish date. Now the reason we minus 1 at the end is just a bit of a standard. The early start date is typically set at the start time of work for that particular day, so for example 8 a.m, whereas the early finish date is typically at 5 p.m. on a particular day. So for example, if you imagine a Monday to Friday week, if you had a 5-day activity and the early start was on Monday, which would be say a 1, plus the duration, which is 5 days, gives you 6. You then take 1 day off to finish up with 5 days for your early finish. So a backward pass is the very similar scheduling concept, except it's starting at the end of the project and then working your way back through. So effectively what it's telling us is, if we were to finish exactly on that finish date, what are the latest dates for every activity that each activity could start and finish? So it basically calculates an activity's late dates. Late dates are the latest times an activity can start and finish without delaying the end of a project. And the calculation begins with the activities that don't have successors, in other words, the finish of the project. So using the same convention as for early dates, the late finish less the duration plus 1 gives us the late start date. Okay, so the next concept to talk about is float. And I don't like to use the term float because it can be a little bit confusing, because there's lots of different types of float, and some of them are really important and some of them are nowhere near as important and nowhere near as significant. So I think the first thing when you're talking about float, it's really important to be specific about what type of float that you're talking about. So firstly, free float. Free float is basically the number of planning units or days, typically in a day-based schedule, that a predecessor activity can slip before it delays the next activity. It's typically calculated as the free float is the early start date of the successor less the early finish date of the activity less 1 day. Right, so the free float just tells us how much any individual activity can slide or slip before it will impact the start of the successor activity. The total float is a lot more significant and a lot more important, and comes into play in terms of prioritising projects, dealing with extensions of time and all sorts of really important areas in project controls. So the total float is the number of planning units or typically days that a predecessor activity or a chain of activity can slip before it delays the completion date of a project or the completion date of a significant milestone or a contractual requirement in the project. So the total float is simply calculated as the late finish date minus the early finish date of an activity. So this is just a screenshot, this slide here, which just shows you one of the fields that's, or the field that's available in P6. It's a standard field, total float. It's fairly easy to bring that field up, and it makes it really easy to identify or the float or the level of tolerance or slip that you can have in different activities. And in this particular case, there's an example of a negative float, which is telling us that already it's impossible for us to finish this project on time. In fact, we're already 3 days behind. Free float is the amount of time an activity can slip without delaying the early start of its successor activities. Far less significance, doesn't need anywhere near the same emphasis as total float. The reason free float becomes interesting is because we can move activities around when they have free float. If we have limited resources or something like that, some of these activities can be moved around fairly easily. Okay, the next step in the process, we're going to talk about the schedule updating process. So this is starting to get into the control loop or the feedback cycle of earned value and project controls. It all starts with a status date. So everything that we do in earned value management is all relative to a particular status date, and all of the reporting is planned around these status dates. And these status dates are basically sweet spots in time where we say, okay, we're going to take a snapshot, we're going to take a pulse of the status of the project at these points. So status updates is never something that's just ad hoc or continuously happening live at any given moment. It's coordinated and designed to be around these particular status dates or status times. The status of completed activities, when we go through this process, the actual mechanical process, it's about providing actual information, so actual start dates, if an activity, or for completed activities, the actual start dates, the actual finish. If an activity isn't finished, the percent complete, and the status of the next activity in the chain. If an activity is finished, you also go on to status the next activity. For in-progress activities, it's about providing an actual start if the activity did start in that particular period, providing a percent complete for work performed during that particular period, and if it's an activity which was due for completion in the current period, in the current reporting period, but it's still not complete, it's about assessing and evaluating and reforecasting when that activity is going to be completed as well. And for activities which haven't been started or completed, it's about assessing them, doing a sense check that they're still planned, their logic is still valid, and that the time phasing is still correct for those activities. Okay, so within the schedule, it's basically a hierarchical structure similar to the WBS that we described earlier, except that the schedule goes down into a lot more detail and includes a lot of logical links that can span and cut across different WBS elements. So a schedule hierarchy, it's basically this vertically integrated set of schedules that depict activities from different levels of detail. So at the highest level, we tend to have sort of major milestones, major project milestones. These are milestones that are typically of interest to the very high-level stakeholders that you might be dealing with. Then as it breaks down into, say, level 2, which typically represents like a summary schedule, so it might represent large bars or phases, large bars which summarise different phases of the project. Down to level 3, where we start to break things down into different disciplines. Down to level 4, where we start to get to deliverables within those disciplines and different work packages. And then down to level 5, which sometimes involves all sorts of very detailed work logs and can involve external spreadsheets and some of those sorts of things. Now those terminologies are quite arbitrary. The main focus is the appreciation of the rolling up of the schedule and that lower level detail informing the higher level details. So you'll often have different stakeholders who want to see the status of the project at different levels. So the schedule's sort of built up to be able to inform all of these different stakeholders. So there's a wide variety of different types of schedule reporting. Bar charts is one of the sort of common sort of a layout that's used, which is just basically project activities shown by a time scale bar line. Gantt charts are extremely common. So it's basically a graphic representation used as an aid for scheduling and for communicating with different stakeholders. It's typically not so good for showing the logical links, but gives a good overall sense of the time phasing. And logic diagrams. So you can have network diagrams or logic diagrams, which are don't show the time phasing so well, but are really good at mapping out the different links between projects. So if you're on a complex program and you're trying to map out the relationship between lots of interrelated packages, it's often helpful to see it in that type of view, because it's the type of thing you can put on a wall, have stakeholders red pen mark up to indicate their dependencies and their interactions with different activities. Next is resource scheduling. So resource scheduling defines which resources, the people, equipment, budgeting, space, material, should be utilised on specific tasks and between which dates. Resourcing is particularly important because it's pretty common on most projects that there are resource constraints or resource bottlenecks somewhere, and by identifying them in the schedule, it helps to identify those problems quickly and solve them early. And even if there aren't those problems, just having the resource in there, it just gives that extra level of assurance and confidence in the schedule that all the problems have been thought through. Resource scheduling basically allows us to analytically manage and use schedule float. So by understanding which activities have total float, those sort of activities can generally be identified as favourites or low-hanging fruit for moving around so as to optimise the resource levelling. You can evaluate the effects or evaluate effects on the limited resources. So if you've got really scarce resources, it's really good for optimising those. You can avoid wide fluctuations in the daily need for various resources. So if you have a project team and you don't want to have them grow very big and then have to let go of people, you'd rather have a good, consistent, stable team of people. It really helps create that profile for the project manager so that he can give them confidence in the project and create a plan that's likely to be more more achievable and create that greater stability for the team as well. Enables us to produce more realistic schedules. Obviously, if you're not analysing the resources, your schedule's not going to be as realistic. You can produce progress and resource curves and comply with client requirements. And in particular, you can forecast your resource loads for the future, for if you do need to transition people to other projects or if you need to recruit and ramp up, you can create that picture from the schedule. It's very easy to graphically show that from the schedule once they're loaded. So in summary, earned value management uses resource-loaded, logically related schedules always. So that's fundamental. Critical path analysis is something that's necessary to do in conjunction with earned value performance metrics. One of the limitations of earned value management is that it alone has no appreciation of critical path or float. So whenever you're implementing EV, part of your EVM system is, yes, we're going to look at the earned value progress measurements, but we're also going to consider total path, critical path as well. There's so many reasons to look at them in conjunction. Even looking at the performance, you can look at your project, you can look at the performance of work packages that have very low levels of total float compared to work packages that have high levels of total float. And if your project is being prioritised well, and if your project manager is doing a good job, chances are the performance on the near critical paths should be more efficient, more effective than it is on the non-critical, because the non-critical you're generally more happy to let them slip a little bit. Okay, so that's the end of the EVP Competency 2 area on planning, budgeting and scheduling. So I encourage you to go through the sample questions in the EVP Certification Study Guide, and don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you have any issues with those problems. Thank you.